You've entered Interstellar Chronicles. Close your eyes and drift into another world, a place where stars whisper forgotten names, where time folds and destinies collide across galaxies. Your journey begins now. The weak human was taken prisoner by an alien commander. He ended up winning her heart. HFY Sci-Fi story. The galaxy, vast and unknowable, was home to more species than any one mind could comprehend. Some were so ancient their names were whispered only in the deepest corners of space, while others were as new and fragile as a spark in the darkness. In the grand expanse, one truth held: the strong survived, and the weak were crushed underfoot, forgotten as stardust in the wind. Humanity, to the other races, was an enigma, physically weak, emotionally volatile, unremarkable in comparison to the countless other civilizations that stretched across the stars. When humans first made contact with the greater galactic community, most species thought them a fleeting curiosity. A few diplomatic representatives, some brave explorers, maybe a handful of scientists. The best they could do was offer a bit of comic relief in the cold, sterile halls of intergalactic meetings. To most species, humans were weak, in every way that mattered. But one human would change everything. Elias Quinn had never thought of himself as a hero. He wasn't built like the men and women whose names were etched into history, or like the noble warriors that filled the ranks of the Varkari Dominion. No, Elias Quinn was ordinary. He had brown eyes, messy hair, and a slight build that never really commanded attention. He wore his humanity like a badge of mild embarrassment, as if his every step was too fragile, too fleeting, for anything grand. As the cultural liaison to the Orion Accord, Elias's job was to be a bridge, a translator of ideas between species, a servant of peace. He wasn't particularly good at least that's what he told himself when he couldn't sleep at night. He wasn't cut out for the politics, the lofty speeches, or the endless rounds of coffee-fueled meetings in the heart of the galactic citadel. But someone had to do it. Someone had to speak for Earth with all its flaws and promises. And so, as he stepped off the transport shuttle at the Laraxis Prime spaceport, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort. The air was thick with the quiet buzz of hundreds of different species all converging in this neutral hub. His people, the humans, were just a small part of the gathering. And for once, Elias wasn't sure whether to be proud of that or to shrink into the shadows. His mission was clear: work with the diplomats of the other species to secure a fragile alliance. A treaty of mutual defense and cooperation that could ensure the survival of all parties. It was the kind of delicate matter that needed someone with grace and tact. But then, of course, there was Virea Thalcor. The Varkari commander had been assigned as his partner on this mission. Virea was a living legend, one of the most feared and respected warriors in the galaxy, known for her strategic brilliance and the ferocity she wielded in battle. She was tall, with skin the color of deep blue twilight and hair like woven silver starlight. Her face was regal, unmarred by emotion, but her eyes, those eyes were what got him. They were cold, calculating, a storm of violet light that could pierce through any veneer of weakness. To humans, she looked like a predator. To everyone else, she was a queen in her own right. And when their eyes met for the first time, Elias immediately felt the weight of her disdain. "You're the human liaison?" Her voice, cool and commanding, cut through the noise of the spaceport. Her gaze was not on him, but rather the man beside him, who had greeted him with a grin that felt far too warm. Elias didn't have to be told how out of place he was. His mere existence was an anomaly in this world of warriors, scholars, and diplomats, beings who had evolved for millennia, each more refined and perfected than the last. And he was nothing special, but he had a job to do. "Yes," he said, standing tall despite the rising tide of anxiety in his chest. "Elias Quinn, diplomatic liaison. Nice to meet you, Commander." Virea only gave a slight nod, the barest acknowledgement. Her eyes flickered over him as if weighing the odds that a human could truly matter. "I see. You may want to keep your wits about you, human. This treaty will be a delicate matter. It requires strength, something you may not be accustomed to." Elias didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that people underestimated him, humans were underestimated. He just had to prove that he could rise to the occasion. The first few days on Loraxus Prime were a blur. Meetings, discussions, power plays behind closed doors. Elias had never been much for diplomacy, and it showed. The Varkari and the Lithari were already at each other's throats. The Inari were off-world trying to broker a separate deal with the Reethi Syndicate, and the Heklu were more concerned with selling weapons than making peace. But it was Virea who caught his attention. Time and time again, she moved through the halls like a storm, impervious to the bickering, the political wrangling, and the cultural clashes. She did not speak much, only when needed, but Elias noticed the way her mere presence silenced the room. There was an elegance to her, a precision, yet there was a coldness that Elias couldn't place. It was when the shuttle mishap happened that everything changed. The diplomatic mission was supposed to be a simple affair. The two of them were to travel to a neutral world on the outskirts of the system, a place where both the Varkari and the humans could discuss terms face to face. But the moment they boarded the shuttle, Elias felt a strange unease ripple through him. Something's wrong, he muttered to himself, fingers twitching over the comms panel as he checked their systems. Virea, seated opposite him, barely looked up from her datapad. It's fine. Focus on the task at hand. But she was wrong. Moments later, a violent shudder rocked the shuttle, sending Elias sprawling across the aisle. The lights flickered and the emergency alarms blared. Shit! Elias cursed, scrambling to his feet. We've been hit. Virea stood with a smooth fluidity that only a warrior like her could manage. Her expression was cool, but Elias could see the flicker of calculation in her eyes. We need to get to the control room now, she ordered, her voice never wavering. But before they could move, another explosion rocked the ship, and the shuttle veered wildly off course. The ship crashed on Yaren V, an ice world far from any civilization. The survivors were minimal, just Elias, Virea, and a handful of the crew. Virea and Elias worked together to establish a base camp from the wreckage, the biting cold seeping into their bones. As the days turned into weeks, they fought to survive, against the harsh weather, the savage wildlife, and a hidden enemy that stalked them from the shadows. Through all of it, Virea remained unshaken. And yet, Elias noticed something subtle in her posture, in her actions. She was not like the others. She had come to trust him. The cold of Yaren V gnawed at them relentlessly. The air was thin. The wind howled like some forgotten creature stalking the landscape. The ground was unforgiving, an endless expanse of ice and jagged rock. Virea had already set up the temporary shelter using pieces of the wreckage. A thermal module hummed in the corner, struggling to keep the temperature stable enough for them to survive. It had been days since the crash, days that blurred into weeks. There were no signs of rescue, no passing ships, no incoming transmissions. The horizon was as desolate as the icy wilderness that surrounded them. They were stuck here together. Elias had never imagined his life would lead him to a place like this, nor had he ever expected to be alone in the cold with someone like Virea. In the beginning, there had been nothing but the silence of mutual distrust. She had, no doubt, considered him weak. He had felt the weight of that assumption, the sharp edge of her gaze, her quiet judgment. But as the days stretched on, Elias had found ways to earn her respect. They hunted together, using the scraps from the shuttle's equipment. Elias had no experience with survival tactics, but necessity sharpened his instincts. Virea, ever the tactical genius, guided him with quiet precision, teaching him how to track the cave lurkers, alien creatures that had once seemed so distant in the safety of the citadel, but now were their only source of sustenance. It wasn't easy, but neither of them was accustomed to failure. They persevered. On the third night after the crash, Elias awoke to the sound of heavy breathing. His pulse quickened. The cave-like shelter they had built from the wreckage felt smaller with each passing hour. The air was still, but the tension hung thick. Virea was crouched by the door, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the thermal module. Her eyes glinted, sharp and unyielding. Something's out there, she murmured, her voice low and steady, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in it. Something had changed in her. The constant wariness, the vigilant eyes, they were softer now, less guarded. She trusted him, Elias realized. They were no longer strangers thrown together by fate. They were comrades, survivors. Elias, ever the pragmatist, reached for his blaster. The pulse of his heartbeat matched the slow thrum of his blood. We need to be careful. There could be more of them. Viraya nodded, her gaze sharpening with the certainty of command. Stay close. Don't speak. They moved silently through the shelter, crouched low against the walls, weapons at the ready. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, reached them first. Then, the growl of something large and predatory. Elias glanced at her. Any ideas? Viraya's lips corked into a brief, deadly smile. Just stay out of my way. She darted forward in a blur of motion, her sleek Varkari combat style taking over. She moved like lightning, her form blurring with grace and deadly precision. Within moments, she had eliminated the threat, two creatures that looked like twisted hybrids of predator and prey. Elias stood frozen, eyes wide. I didn't even see you move. Viraya stood over the carcasses, wiping the blood from her blade, a slight chuckle escaping her lips. I suppose I made a good impression after all. His heart was racing, but something else surged in his chest. A deep, inexplicable pride. In that moment, he realized something profound. It wasn't that he was scared of her. He was afraid of what would happen if he ever failed her. The days passed, and their bond only deepened. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something else, something raw and undeniable. The warmth between them, the trust that had slowly kindled in the face of their shared struggle, was something Elias had never felt with anyone before. But they couldn't outrun their differences forever. One night, as they sat around a fire, their food cooking in a pot made from a destroyed piece of the shuttle, Elias spoke. You know, he began, his voice softer than usual. I've been thinking about what you said when we first met, about me being weak. Viraya didn't look up from the fire, though he could feel her attention sharpen on him. I was wrong, she said, her voice quiet. Humans are not weak. You're different, in ways I don't fully understand. Elias chuckled softly, looking into the flickering flames. We all have our weaknesses, I guess. We just deal with them differently. Viraya finally looked at him, her violet eyes locking onto his. And how do you deal with it, human? He paused. By doing what needs to be done, no matter what, even if it means risking everything. There was a long silence, one that seemed to stretch out into eternity. Then, almost as if to break the tension, Viraya stood up, brushing the snow from her pants. She offered him a hand, a rare gesture of camaraderie. Then we survive. Together. He took it, feeling the warmth of her hand. Strong, steady, unwavering. The next day, the storm hit. A violent blizzard swept through the ice plains, stronger than any they had encountered before. The visibility dropped to zero. They were forced to huddle together in the wreckage, their survival hanging on the thread of their ingenuity and willpower. For hours, they sat in silence, listening to the howling winds outside, the constant groan of the crumbling shelter. Elias couldn't help but notice the quiet way Viraya seemed to retreat into herself. She had always been distant, but now, she seemed more withdrawn, more lost in thought. Viraya, Elias called out, his voice breaking through the endless noise. Hey, talk to me. What's going on in that head of yours? Viraya didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was lower than usual. I've never been this vulnerable before. Never been out of control. Elias blinked in surprise. You? The great Commander Viraya Thalkor? She turned to him, a trace of something like a smile on her lips. I thought I was invincible. But this planet, this situation. She stopped, and for a moment her guard was down. Elias saw the vulnerability beneath the warrior's steel exterior. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't some unfeeling automaton. She was human just like him. And that was when Elias realized just how much he had come to depend on her. "Hey," he said softly, crossing the small space between them. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." Viraya met his gaze, her eyes softening. She didn't say anything, but the weight of her stare told him everything he needed to know. Days turned into weeks, and the storm finally broke. The world outside was still a frozen wasteland, but the two of them had found a new rhythm, a new understanding. And then, when they least expected it, their rescuer arrived. The signal had finally been detected. The distress beacon they'd activated from the wreckage had reached the right hands. A ship, the Stellar Hawk, came down from the stars. At that moment, Viraya turned to him, her eyes soft. "You've done more for me than I ever thought possible, Elias." Elias smiled faintly, his heart thundering in his chest. "I guess I didn't turn out to be the weakling everyone expected after all." She laughed, a sound like the breaking of a storm. "No, Elias, you're something far more dangerous." They stood side by side, watching as the Stellar Hawk touched down, its engines roaring in the stillness. The war had never been as important as this, the peace never as fragile. But as long as they were together, strong, weak, human or alien, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The Stellar Hawk's landing marked the beginning of the end for their time on Yaren V. The rescue had been close, too close for comfort. It had taken nearly a month for anyone to notice their distress signal, and the storm had nearly claimed them both. Yet, despite the relief that came with their extraction, Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't over. The Stellar Hawk was a warship, sleek and built for combat. The crew aboard, mostly mercenaries hired to protect the peacekeeping missions, gave them a wary glance as they boarded. A few were familiar with the diplomatic team from the Accord, but none of them seemed eager to engage in conversation. Elias didn't mind. The silence suited him. What had mattered more was that the entire trip had been fraught with the deep, unspoken tension that had been steadily building between him and Viraya. As they traveled through the vastness of space back toward the core, the weight of their time on Yaren V settled heavily between them, unspoken but undeniable. It was late into the journey when Viraya approached him. They had been living in close quarters aboard the Stellar Hawk, and although they shared little more than glances and nods, the space felt charged with a tension that neither could escape. Elias was at the observation deck when she arrived, looking out into the endless void of stars, his mind restless. "How are you holding up?" Viraya's voice broke the silence, though it was softer than usual, less commanding. The sharpness had dulled, revealing something beneath the hardened exterior. Elias turned toward her, meeting her gaze. There was something new there, a kind of uncertainty, vulnerability. It wasn't the usual Viraya, the unshakable warrior. This Viraya was more human, more real. "I'm alive," he said with a wry smile, trying to keep it light. "Guess that's more than I expected." She didn't laugh, though the corners of her mouth twitched as if she was resisting it. "You've surprised me, Elias. I think I've surprised myself," he replied, stepping closer to her. The distance between them, which had once been an ocean of distrust, had evaporated over the weeks. It was strange how easily they fell into silence, how their movements now felt synchronized, as if they had always been this way. "You've done more than any human I've met," she continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You're nothing like I thought." "And what did you think I was like?" Elias asked, his tone playful but edged with curiosity. Viraya's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, before she spoke. "Weak, fragile, someone who would cower in the face of danger." Her gaze darkened for a moment, as if reflecting on the past. "But you didn't. You stood beside me when others would have turned their backs. You never wavered." Elias's chest tightened. There it was, the truth that had lingered between them for so long. "Viraya, you—" But before he could finish, the ship's alarms suddenly rang, slicing through the quiet tension like a blade. Viraya's eyes snapped to the ceiling as the red lights began to flash. "We're under attack," she said, her voice instantly shifting back into the command mode he had known so well. Without thinking, They both moved in unison, heading for the control deck. The Stellar Hawk was no stranger to skirmishes, but Elias had learned quickly that this wasn't just any attack. This was different. The crew was scrambling, weapons were being drawn, and the captain's voice blared over the comms. Enemy ships inbound. They've breached our defenses. We need all hands at the ready. Verea's face hardened, her posture straight and poised for battle. She turned to Elias, her eyes narrowing. Stay close, and keep your head. I don't plan on dying today, Elias replied with a smirk that barely hid the unease he was feeling. The two of them rushed through the chaos of the ship, moving with synchronized precision that felt natural now. They reached the weapons bay, where Verea immediately took command, organizing the mercenaries into their respective stations. Elias wasn't a trained soldier, but he had a steady hand and a keen mind. He joined the crew at a weapons console, firing the ship's cannons at the incoming enemy craft, hoping his aim would be enough. The battle was fierce. The Stellar Hawk rocked under enemy fire, and the ship's shields began to flicker and fail under the barrage. Elias did his best to keep pace, his pulse hammering in his ears as he fired shots, only to watch them deflect off the enemy shields. Verea was at the helm, her presence an anchor to the chaos. Her command was absolute, her tactics sharp. He'd never seen anything like it, but it wasn't enough. The enemy ships, sleek and nimble, were overwhelming the Stellar Hawk. We need to take out their main weapon systems, Verea shouted above the din of alarms. Elias, can you do it? He nodded, even though he had no idea how. But the sheer force of her belief in him, in them, drove him to act. They weren't going to lose. Not now, not after everything they had endured together. Elias moved with urgency, rushing to the ship's auxiliary systems. With shaky hands, he bypassed the control interfaces, trying desperately to hack into the enemy's weapon systems. He didn't have the luxury of time, and every moment felt like a countdown to his own death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to disable their weapon systems. The Stellar Hawk's shields held, and the enemy ships began to retreat, their forces scattering like frightened prey. Elias collapsed against the console, his heart racing. Verea was at his side in an instant, her eyes scanning the damage, her body tense with the remnants of the battle. But there was a flicker of something else in her expression, something different. You did it, she said, her voice low and almost reverent. Elias exhaled sharply, his chest heavy with adrenaline. I guess I'm not the weak human anymore. Verea looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time there was no sarcasm, no judgment in her eyes. There was only respect, admiration, and something else he couldn't name. But it was there. Before he could say anything more, the captain's voice echoed across the ship's comms. All systems are stable. Enemy ships have retreated. We're safe for now. In the days that followed, the ship limped its way toward the galactic capital. Elias and Verea stood side by side, navigating the delicate peace talks with a confidence neither of them had expected. They'd won the battle, but the war for the future was just beginning. And then, one evening, as the stars passed by in their eternal dance outside the ship's windows, Verea stood beside Elias on the observation deck again, just as they had on Yaren V. This time, there was no fear in the air, no tension, just the quiet hum of two people who had been through something together, something that had changed them both. I owe you an apology, Verea said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with something deeper than she'd ever shown before. I didn't believe in you, in humans, but you showed me that we're capable of more than we ever thought. Elias smiled, the weight of everything they'd been through pressing on his heart. You've changed too, you know, he said quietly. You're not just a warrior anymore. You're more than that. Verea's lips quirked in that rare, almost mischievous way. Maybe, she said, taking a step closer, her presence surrounding him like a protective shield. But I couldn't have done it without you. Their gazes locked for a moment, and Elias's heart skipped a beat. This time there was no doubt between them, only the promise of a future they would build together side by side. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more challenges to face. But as the stellar hawk sailed toward the heart of the galaxy, Elias and Varea knew one thing for sure. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a team, and nothing, no enemy, no obstacle, could break them apart. The days aboard the stellar hawk were long, each one marked by the tension of their mission. The war was escalating. The enemy, the Zorvian Confederacy, had become more aggressive. Their fleet was larger, their weapons more advanced. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future of the galaxy. Elias could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Despite everything they had been through, he still considered himself an outsider, a human in the midst of an interspecies war. He had no place in their galaxy, no stake in the political games that were being played. But his connection with Varea, the bond they had forged in the fires of Yaren V, made him feel something more. She had come to see him as more than just a soldier, a capable partner, someone she could trust. Yet that trust would be tested. One evening, the stellar hawk dropped out of warp, the ship shaking as the engines powered down. Varea appeared in the doorway of the command center, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp. Elias looked up from the console where he had been reviewing tactical data. His heart sank at the sight of her. Varea! He rose from his seat, concern rising in his chest. What's wrong? She didn't immediately answer. Her gaze was distant, focused on something far beyond the walls of the ship. Then, she spoke, her voice tinged with something Elias couldn't quite place. The Zorvian fleet is here. Elias blinked. Wait, here? You mean there? There in the sector, she interrupted, her tone colder than he had ever heard it. And they're preparing for a full-scale assault. The peace talks failed. That's not good. Elias's mind raced. We need to warn the capital. They're already aware, she said, cutting him off again, her gaze hardening. But we're not getting out of this without a fight. Elias swallowed. We? You mean you're going to lead the charge? Varea's eyes flicked to him, unreadable. I'll do what I must. We all will. This is the final push. If the Zorvians win this battle, the galaxy will fall into chaos. Not if we have a say in it. Elias took a step toward her, his jaw tightening. We've beaten worse odds together. We can do this. She regarded him for a moment, her gaze softening. You think so? She asked, her voice almost vulnerable. Elias reached out, a rare gesture of sincerity passing between them. I know so. There was a moment of silence as Varea held his gaze. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. Then we fight, she said. The battle that ensued was nothing short of catastrophic. The Zorvian fleet, massive and highly advanced, descended upon the planetary defenses of the capital. The Stellar Hawk joined the fray, its weapons firing in rapid succession as the crew fought tooth and nail to hold their ground. The galaxy's fate hung in the balance, and both Elias and Varea knew that the stakes were higher than ever. Despite their training, despite their resilience, the battle seemed endless. Zorvian ships, sleek, brutal, and heavily armed, shredded the defenses of the planet one by one. The Stellar Hawk was caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse with Zorvian cruisers, their massive guns pounding the ship's shields until they flickered and crackled under the pressure. Elias was at a console, his mind working frantically to reroute power to the shields. Beside him, Varea was giving orders, her voice ringing out like a battle cry, urging the crew to fight harder, faster. But even with their combined efforts, it felt like they were losing ground. The Zorvian fleet was simply too powerful. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The ship shook violently as a Zorvian cruiser slammed into them. Elias stumbled but caught himself on the console. He looked up to see Varea bracing herself against the impact, her expression fierce, unyielding. She was a warrior, forged in the fires of battle, but even she was not immune to the chaos around them. Varea! Elias shouted, rushing to her side. What's the plan? We can't keep taking hits like this. She turned to him, her eyes narrowing with determination. We take the fight to them. We infiltrate their flagship. Infiltrate? Are you insane? Elias's voice was laced with disbelief. We'll get torn apart before we even make it inside. Verea's lips curled into a smile, one that was both confident and dangerous. You said it yourself. We've beaten worse odds. Yeah, but this time there's a fleet between us and the enemy ship. She didn't answer immediately, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. We have one shot at this. If we don't take down their command center, we'll never win. Elias looked at her, his mind racing. He knew that if they didn't act soon, they would be overwhelmed. But this was madness. All right, he said, nodding reluctantly. What's the plan? The Stellar Hawk fired a series of decoy flares to divert attention, allowing the small infiltration team, led by Verea and Elias, to make a stealthy approach toward the Zorvian flagship. The ship was a behemoth, and its defenses were formidable. But they had one advantage. Surprise. Elias and Verea, working as a seamless unit, navigated through the Zorvian cruiser's labyrinthine hallways, dodging patrols and silently eliminating anyone who stood in their way. The deeper they went into the heart of the flagship, the more Elias felt the intensity of their mission. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about changing the course of the galaxy's future. They were fighting for more than just their lives. Finally, they reached the control center. But it wasn't just the Zorvian command staff waiting for them. The flagship's commander, a towering armored figure with an air of ancient power, stood at the control panel, flanked by elite warriors. Verea didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her blade flashing in a deadly arc. Elias fired, taking out one of the guards before sprinting to join her. The battle was brutal. Elias had never seen anything like it. The Zorvian warriors were fierce, but Verea was faster. She moved like lightning, her blade cutting through their defenses as if they were nothing. Elias was right behind her, doing everything he could to keep up. But it wasn't enough. The Zorvian commander, taller than any humanoid Elias had ever seen, was a force unto himself. His strikes were powerful, almost overwhelming. Elias could see Verea struggling to match his blows, her movements slowed by the weight of their conflict. Then, just as it seemed like all hope was lost, Elias saw it. The weakness, the opening. With a surge of adrenaline, he threw himself forward, tackling the commander from behind. In that moment of vulnerability, Verea drove her blade through the commander's chest, and the battle was won. The silence that followed was deafening. The Zorvian forces retreated, their flagship destroyed. The galaxy had been saved, but the cost was high. As Elias and Verea stood amid the wreckage, breathing heavily, their bodies bruised and bloodied, they shared a moment of quiet understanding. Their relationship, forged in the fires of battle, had become something far more than either of them had expected. Verea turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. We did it. Elias nodded, but his voice was soft, vulnerable. I couldn't have done it without you. Verea reached out, her hand brushing his cheek. And I couldn't have done it without you. There were no more words, no need for them. Their connection was enough. They had fought together, survived together, and now they would build a future together. The war was over, but the galaxy would never be the same. Elias and Verea returned to the capital as heroes, their names forever etched in the annals of history. But it wasn't the fame that mattered to them. It was the quiet moments they shared, knowing that together, they had changed the course of the galaxy's fate. And as they stood together, overlooking the stars, Elias realized that he had found something he never expected to find on this journey. A home, not in the galaxy, but in her. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Elias couldn't help but feel a lingering unease as he looked out at the stars from the command deck of the Stellar Hawk. The mission had been a success, but they hadn't eliminated the Zorvian threat. The enemy fleet had retreated, but they weren't vanquished, not by a long shot. The Confederacy would regroup, rebuild, and come again. They had no choice but to continue the fight. The galaxy depended on it. As Elias stared out into the void, his thoughts were interrupted by the soft but commanding voice of Verea. Elias, she said, her tone sharp and direct. "We need to talk." He turned, his eyes meeting hers. They'd been through so much in the past weeks, but there was a new tension between them, something unspoken, hanging heavy in the air. He'd grown used to her sharp, warrior-like demeanor, but there was a shift, a subtle but unmistakable change. "Sure," he said, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. He stepped toward her, the weight of their shared experience pressing down on him. It wasn't just the war that had brought them together, it was everything. The way they had fought side by side, the way she had come to see him not as a weak human, but as something more. "Not here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned and began walking, and Elias followed her without question. They moved through the corridors of the ship, the hum of the engines beneath their feet a steady backdrop to the growing tension between them. Viraya led him to the observation deck, a quiet place where they could see the stars stretching infinitely before them. The darkness outside seemed to echo the feeling in his chest, a deep, gnawing uncertainty. She stopped, her back to the windows, and turned to face him. "You're still the same," she said, her voice almost accusing. "The same as when I first met you. Strong, persistent, unwilling to back down. You fought for me, for the galaxy. But this isn't over, Elias." Elias swallowed. Her words stung, but there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something deeper. "I know," he said, his voice low. "I know the war isn't over, but we've done good work. We've made a difference. We can stop this." Her gaze softened for a moment, but the doubt in her eyes remained. "You're not listening to me. It's not about us winning or losing, Elias. It's about you. You don't realize how much you've changed me. And I." Her voice faltered, and Elias took a step toward her. His heart was pounding, each beat louder than the last. "Viraya, you don't have to say it." She looked at him, her eyes conflicted. "Ido, I have to say it, because I don't know what this is, Elias. You've shown me what humanity can be. Brave, unyielding, capable of things we never imagined. But I'm not sure what you want from me anymore." Elias's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her expression torn. "I've been fighting my entire life, Elias. I fought for survival, for honor, for my people. I don't know how to stop fighting. But with you, I don't know how to fight this. I don't know how to fight what I'm feeling." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Elias reached out, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, his thumb brushing against the cool fabric of her armor. "Viraya, I'm not asking you to stop fighting. I'm asking you to fight with me. Not just for the galaxy, but for us. Together." She hesitated, her breathing shallow, and then slowly, her hand moved to meet his. The simple contact, the warmth of it, spoke volumes. It wasn't just the touch of a warrior in the heat of battle. It was something tender, something that spoke of trust and mutual understanding. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've never let myself need anyone." "You don't need to," Elias said gently. "You never needed anyone before me. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. You've taught me so much about myself, about what I'm capable of. Maybe we're both learning how to be something more than just survivors." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with the weight of years of struggle, of war, of sacrifice. And in that moment, something shifted in her. Something broke free, just as it had in Elias. It wasn't just the battle that had changed them. It was each other. "I've never been good at this," she said with a rueful smile. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to be perfect." Elias smiled, a soft, genuine smile that felt like a weight lifting from his chest. "I'm not perfect either, and I don't need you to be. I just need you. We need each other." The words were out before either of them could stop them, and for the first time in a long while, Elias felt something other than the weight of war. He felt peace. Days passed, and the war continued to escalate, but the dynamic between them had changed. They were no longer just comrades in arms, they were partners. They found strength in each other, pushing through the endless battles and negotiations with a shared resolve. They knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not now, not ever. But together, they became a force the galaxy hadn't anticipated. The Zorvian threat loomed larger than ever, and soon, the conflict reached its breaking point. The Stellar Hawk would be called to make its final stand against the Zorvian fleet in a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The final battle came faster than they expected. The Zorvian fleet had regrouped, and their assault on the core worlds was imminent. It was the Stellar Hawk's last mission, a final push to crush the Confederacy once and for all. Varaya and Elias stood side by side in the war room, staring at the holographic map of the battlefield. The numbers were staggering. The enemy fleet was vast, their weapons and technology far superior to anything the human-led alliance could muster. It was a battle they could not afford to lose. "Last chance," the commander said, his voice grave. "We have one shot at this. We make a move now or it's over." Varaya turned to Elias, her face determined but filled with a quiet sadness. "No matter what happens, we do this together." Elias nodded, his hand resting on her arm. Together, the battle was a cataclysmic clash of ships and soldiers, of strategy and sacrifice. The Stellar Hawk fought valiantly, but the tide seemed to be turning against them. Elias and Varaya fought side by side, pushing through the chaos, their bond stronger than ever. Every move, every command was given with a shared understanding, a silent communication that only they could share. Then came the moment. The Zorvian flagship, massive and imposing, was within range. The final move, the one that would end it all. Elias and Varaya boarded the Stellar Hawk's last-ditch assault shuttle, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that their survival was unlikely, but they had no choice. This was the galaxy's last hope, the final act of defiance. With weapons primed and shields down, they sped toward the heart of the enemy fleet. As the shuttle's engines roared and the stars streaked past, Elias and Varaya shared a final, silent glance. No words were needed. They had already said everything that mattered. The shuttle collided with the flagship's core, a violent explosion of light and energy that sent shockwaves through the enemy fleet. The Zorvian command was shattered, their forces decimated. But the cost had been high. The Stellar Hawk was lost. Elias and Varaya were gone. The galaxy was at peace, but their legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed their courage, their love, and their sacrifice. Years later, in the halls of the Galactic Council, they would speak of the humans who had shown them all what true bravery and love looked like. They would speak of Elias and Varaya, the human and the warrior who had changed the course of history, and the stars they would remember. But legends are rarely so final. In the debris field where the Zorvian flagship had once floated, a shattered colossus drifting in the silence between stars, a tiny emergency beacon pulsed weakly, buried beneath twisted metal and the cold dark of space. A stasis pod blinked to life, hissing softly as it detected nearby recovery signals. Aboard the pod, barely alive but stable, lay Elias. He awoke to pain and dim blue lights. His body was restrained, healing foam hardening across his ribs. His vision swam. He coughed, trying to speak. A voice answered him, not mechanical, not sterile. "Familiar. I told you not to die without me." Elias blinked. She was sitting beside the pod, bruised and bandaged but alive. Alive. Eyes darker now, older somehow. "Varaya, you made it," he whispered. "So did you." She leaned in, placing a hand over his. "Barely. You stubborn, reckless, wonderful idiot." A long silence passed. The hum of the medical frigate systems surrounded them, broken only by the soft rasp of their breath. Then Elias grinned faintly. "I guess we're not done saving the galaxy." Varaya chuckled. A low, tired, beautiful sound. "No. But we're allowed to rest. Just for a little while." 6 months later, New Axis Station. Orbiting a liberated world once held by Zorvian chains, New Axis Station gleamed like a second sun. It was not just a military hub, but a symbol, a joint command post built by the species that had once doubted one another. There were statues here now, stories, murals of the Stellar Hawk's crew painted by children from half a dozen worlds. Elias stood on the central promenade, freshly dressed in an understated dark uniform, no longer the nameless human he once was. His posture had changed, stronger, more at peace, but his eyes held the same quiet warmth. The galaxy had changed, and so had he. He wasn't a myth. He was just a man who did what he had to. Behind him, Viraya approached, armor retired for ceremonial robes woven in silver-threaded tones of her people's nobility. Her head was bare, a statement in itself. She no longer needed a mask of command. She had earned something rarer, trust. She came to stand beside him, arms crossed lightly. "They're naming a fleet after you." Elias winced. "Tell them not to, or at least pick someone handsomer." She smirked. "Too late. The humans are already printing recruitment posters." He looked at her, teasing aside. "And what about you?" Still tempted to vanish into some cold battlefield again, she turned to face him fully. Her expression softened. "No. For the first time, I want to see what comes after war. I want to see what peace looks like. With you." There was a quiet in that moment that felt deeper than silence. A peace forged not by absence of conflict, but by hard-won connection. Viraya stepped closer. "My people used to believe love was weakness, that it distracted from purpose." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And now, she whispered, "I understand that love is purpose." He reached for her hand and held it as the station's evening lights blinked into golden glow around them, and the stars wheeled in slow motion beyond the great glass dome. In the years that followed, the galaxy rebuilt itself. Not easily, not perfectly, but with new foundations laid on unlikely alliances. Human insight became a sought-after quality. Earth's diplomats, engineers, and explorers began to seed new relations, learning faster than any species expected. And always, the story of Elias and Vireo lingered in the minds of all who doubted what humanity could offer. They did not retire, not really. Vireo became a respected speaker for the interstellar concord. Elias took on a quiet role as a mentor and strategist, working with alien youth to reshape what cooperation could mean. Sometimes they traveled together, sometimes apart, but they always returned to one another, finding new ways to belong in a galaxy that now had room for them both. And though neither of them said it aloud, each day they shared was a quiet rebellion against everything the war had tried to take. 10 years later, archive of the first piece. An elderly historian speaks to a gathering of children in a great domed room carved from the rock of an orbital moon. Holograms shimmer behind him, displaying images from the war, faces captured in crystalline memory. And so it was that Elias Tren, the soft-shelled human no one believed in, stood at the turning point of our history, the historian says. He was not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor even the smartest, but he was something else entirely. He gestures to a shimmering image of Elias and Viraya, side by side on the bridge of the Stellar Hawk, back straight, eyes forward. He was human, the historian says simply, in the best sense of the word, and that made all the difference. The children are silent, listening, learning, hoping. Outside, the stars go on shining, as they always have, but now they shine over a galaxy that remembers. The winds blew gently across the ridged spires of Walorani Prime, carrying the scent of soft dusk blossoms. Flowers once thought impossible to cultivate off Earth, now thriving, coaxed into bloom by Terran and Ilian biologists working together. The garden was quiet, painted in the warm hues of evening. Above, twin moons rose slowly into the sky, casting long shadows across the terrace stones. Elias stood on a hilltop path, a modest silhouette against the planet's violet dusk. His hair was streaked now with silver at the temples. Time had added weight to his shoulders, but not dulled his presence. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, slower, perhaps, but filled with peace. He reached down and let his fingers brush the tops of the grass, letting the air speak to him. Behind him came soft footsteps. Viraya approached with her usual quiet grace, no longer clad in battle-armored regalia but in a simple, elegant robe of midnight silver and warm threadwork, a blend of her people's ceremonial patterns and Earth's minimalist tradition. Her hair, once always bound for war, now fell freely down her back, touched by faint streaks of age, yet more radiant than ever. He heard her and turned, smiling before he saw her. "You're late," he said gently. "I came as quickly as I could," she replied, stepping beside him. "Diplomacy now takes longer than war." Elias chuckled. "That's how you know we're doing it right." They looked out across the vast garden that sloped down to the valley. Nestled near the foot of the hill stood a new structure. Not grand, not towering. A bench. The tree. A plaque. She noticed it. "That wasn't here last week." "I commissioned it," Elias admitted. "Didn't tell anyone. Wanted it quiet." She stepped closer and read the inscription aloud. "To those who reached across the stars and chose each other." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Then, without comment, she sat gently on the bench. Elias joined her. Above them, wind chimes sang soft notes from a nearby archway. Around them, the fireflies, glow wasps, technically, rose into the air in lazy spirals, their bodies pulsing with a warm golden light. Viraya turned her head, resting it against his shoulder. "I've been offered a place on the High Assembly," she murmured. "Advisor to the Concord." He breathed in. "That's big. They want me to help mediate between the frontier colonies and the Halvarni delegations." "Will you take it?" he asked. "Only if you'll come argue with me every third meeting." He smiled and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That's the only reason I'd go." For a long while, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The years had granted them a fluency that lived between silence and breath. Then, softly, she asked, "Do you regret anything?" He considered. "Not the battles. Not the wounds. Not the nights spent in corridors filled with fire and blood. Sometimes I regret the time we lost. All the years I didn't know you." She was quiet. "But," he continued, "I also know I met you when I was ready, when we both were. Before that, I think we would have missed each other." Viraya nodded slowly, her voice no louder than a breeze. "You saved me, Elias." He turned to look at her. "From being a weapon," she said. "And you saved me," he replied, "from being ordinary." She laughed quietly at that. "You were never ordinary, just underappreciated." "You were terrible at small talk," he added. "Still am." They smiled, and for a moment, the galaxy seemed to still in reverence to this quiet thing between them. Not a love forged in perfect timing, but one built through the furnace of struggle, misunderstanding, sacrifice, and choice. Later that night, they stood together again on the balcony of their modest hilltop home. The stars wheeled above them, slow and bright, unhurried. Beyond the horizon, the gentle glow of the new Concord's capital shimmered like a reflection of the sky. Viraya reached into the folds of her robe and retrieved a small crystal, smooth, pale blue, tear-shaped. "I've written our story," she said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "You? A memoir? More like a record, a reminder, for those who'll come after." He took the crystal gently, held it up to the starlight. It flickered faintly, coated with memory. "I want people to remember," she said softly. "That peace didn't come because of our weapons, or strategy, or technology." She looked at him, her expression naked and sure. "It came because someone chose to stay, to speak, to listen, to love." Elias was quiet for a moment, and then kissed her hand. "What did you call it?" he asked. She smirked just a little. "Humanity. F asterisk asterisk yeah. Asterisk." He broke into a laugh, full-bodied. "Real." "No, you didn't." "I did. Viraya. You said it first, remember?" He groaned. "Please tell me the High Assembly won't see the title." "I made two versions." They leaned against the rail, watching the stars move, as laughter gave way to quiet once more. Not silence. Not anymore. Just a shared stillness, the kind earned after long journeys and unthinkable choices. And far above them, the stars burned. Not in judgment, not in destruction, but in witness. Centuries later, long after their names became myth, a voice echoed in a crystalline archive floating between systems. A voice not human nor alien, but woven from both. They were not the strongest, not the most perfect, but they were brave and kind and terrifying in their refusal to give up. They showed us that love is not weakness. That connection, even between enemies, can shatter the old laws of the galaxy. They were human, and she chose them, and for that, the stars remember,